Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this APDA Passport to Research series. My name is Dave Grosby. I'm a longtime sportscaster in Seattle, partially retired a couple years back. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in November of 2018, and very fortunate to have a connection with APDA here in the Northwest, and I'm very happy to be involved in this series with you. APDA's dual mission of providing help for today to those living with Parkinson's and hope for tomorrow by investing in critical research projects is why I'm very proud to be associated with this organization. Now, research is what we're here to talk about today. APDA has invested nearly $51 million into critical research since 1961, and the Northwest chapter is proud to be the sole funder of the Parkinson's Disease Registry, which helps speed up the research process by connecting researchers to willing participants. So make sure you keep an eye on your post-event email for more information about that registry and how to get involved. There really is some amazing research going on right here in the Northwest, and we hope through this series you will learn more about the work being done and the people behind it, and also how you can be involved. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to thank the sponsors of this program: Gold sponsor Kiowa Kirin, Synovian, and Niagara Bottling, Silver sponsor Amneal, and Bronze sponsor Boston Scientific. Their support of APDA and their value of educational programs like this is immensely appreciated. Tonight's Passports to Research series is entitled Disease Modifying Trials for Early PD. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Pinky Agarwal and Dr. Daniel Burdick from Evergreen Health, located in Kirkland, Washington. Dr. Agarwal is a neurologist at Evergreen's Booth Gardner Parkinson's Care Center in Kirkland. Is professor of neurology at the University of Washington, board certified in neurology, and fellowship trained in movement disorders at the Neurological Institute in the Columbian Presbyterian Medical Center. Has served in a role as principal investigator or sub-investigator in more than 100 critical trials. Dr. Daniel Burdick, a neurologist at the Evergreen Health Booth Gardner Parkinson's Care Center in Kirkland, board certified in neurology, fellowship trained in all movement disorders. Dr. Burdick specializes in the evaluation and management of patients with Parkinson's disease. Doctors, thank you very much for being with us today.
Sure.
It's a pleasure. Thank you
for having us.
I'll ask a few questions and you can just answer them. Each one of you should answer the questions, obviously. And we appreciate your insights and invite everyone who would like to join in to ask your questions. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, we will take them. First question, why should patients participate in research?
So, we know that Parkinson's disease, we are lucky enough that there are several medications that are currently marketed and are FDA approved. However, we also know that there are limitations in the current treatment options. And some of them are that all of the current medications are currently symptomatic. And we really want a medication that would ideally slow the disease progression. And at the same time, also optimize treatment of the motor and the non-motor symptoms. And so participation in clinical trials will hopefully come up with a disease modifying therapy and maybe better treatment options for symptomatic treatment.
Dr. Burdick?
Yeah, well, completely agree with what Dr. Agarwal said. I would add, participating in clinical trials is a great way to feel like you're a part of something bigger, right? So that's one of the reasons that I do it, frankly. I enjoy seeing patients and using the medications that we do have available to try to help improve symptoms. But there's always that point where, and I'm sure everyone on this call has experienced it, where we're just left needing something more, right? And probably feeling a little bit frustrated with not having more. And participating in clinical trials is a way for all of us, the physicians and the patients, to come together as a team to really develop that treatment pathway and to develop new treatments. And as Dr. Agarwal said, to develop treatments that not only improve the symptoms, but help slow down the disease process. So a lot of the people that have been my patients and that have participated in clinical trials have told me how meaningful it is to feel like they're playing that bigger part, that bigger role in the Parkinson's global community.
Dr. Burdick, we'll start with you on this one. What is the experience like for a patient who participates in research at Evergreen Health?
Well, it depends on the trial specifically, but I guess I would say overall the experience should be one of feeling really welcomed and brought into that team that I was describing. A lot of people will be really impressed with the access that they have, because when you're on a clinical trial, you're one of really relatively few patients working on that trial. And so we have a specific coordinator for each study who works very closely with those patients. And so you get to know the team really well. And in addition, you often are experiencing longer visits and more frequent visits than we have the luxury of having in the regular clinic. So I think the experience is generally one of, as I say, feeling like a real part of the team and feeling really welcomed into it. The flip side is the experience is one of needing to put a little bit more commitment into it because there are more frequent visits and they are longer. So it's kind of the flip side of that having that connection, but also being able to commit to those longer visits.
Dr. Agarwal?
I agree entirely with Dr. Burdick that I think the main part of participating in research, the positive part, is actually the one-on-one connection and the longer visits. Also, patients oftentimes will have procedures that they can't have outside a trial because insurance won't cover it. So for instance, DAT scans are covered oftentimes in patients who have Medicare, but patients who have private insurance actually oftentimes have a hard time getting their DAT scans covered. So, and those are quite routine now as part of several clinical trials. And then some clinical trials have EKGs, safety labs, etc., built in. And so there is a lot of monitoring and the bonding that one forms with the team because of the longer study visits and the more intense monitoring. And then again, like Dr. Burdick said, being part of that higher purpose with a committed team caring for them generally makes research a very rewarding and pleasant experience. And a lot of patients who've participated in one trial at the time of exit will tell us that they'd like to participate in the next trial that they're eligible for. And that's probably the biggest testament to that being a pleasant experience for them.
Next question. This topic is called disease-modifying trials for early PD. Dr. Agarwal, we'll start with you. How much work is being done in this area?
So there's like a tremendous amount of both time and money being invested in early PD, mainly for disease modification. So like I mentioned, current medications are mainly symptomatic. And ideally what we'd like to do is once we diagnose a patient, to slow what that normal slope would be over time. The challenges of disease modifying treatment is you are trying to get things into the brain past the blood-brain barrier. And so sometimes you need somewhat more invasive methods, maybe like some disease modifying treatment are oral capsules, but sometimes you have to do spinal taps to measure that enough of the study medication is actually making its way to the brain and into the cerebrospinal fluid. And then there's also challenges about how to design the trial, where people have tried washout trials or wash-ins. So basically you have to compare how people on the study medication would maybe do compared to other people not on study medication. So there are lots of trials, and actually Evergreen has about 4 or 5 trials going on right now, some with me, some with Dr. Burdick, and we have our colleague, Dr. Griffith. So between us, we have about 4 or 5 trials going on for disease modification.
Anything to add, Dr. Burdick?
Yeah, well, I think Dr. Agarwal hit it on the head. It's a very active area of research, and certainly that finding that disease modifying treatment has been sort of the holy grail of Parkinson's research for a while, and still searching. But when I last looked, there was in the U.S. at least, I think there was over a dozen trials looking at ways to try to slow down the disease progression of Parkinson's. So, and then as Dr. Agarwal said, we have 4 or 5 of those right here at Evergreen. So definitely an active area of research.
Got it. Dr. Burdick, what do you want a patient to know ahead of time before participating in the clinical trial?
Well, in general, I think it's important to know a few things. So obviously, we'd want a patient to know what the what to expect in terms of the procedures during the trial, how frequent the visits are, how long the visits might be. It's important to understand the role of the placebo control as well. That's a barrier for a lot of people because there's the idea that we want to get into a clinical trial so that we get this new exciting treatment, right? And when we talk about the placebo control, sometimes that's a bit of a drawback. So I'd want people to understand how critical that placebo control is and what an important role even patients who are getting the placebo are playing in the development of that treatment. It's absolutely critical because without a placebo control, we don't know if the medication actually works, right? So that's an important thing to understand. And of course, we'd want to talk about what the expected benefits are of the potential treatment and what the potential side effects are. So I think those would be the main things.
Okay, Dr. Agarwal, anything to add?
I agree with what Dr. Burdick said. And also, sometimes, like was discussed earlier, there's more time commitment, more investigations. And so patients do sometimes have to have additional MRI scans or additional DAT scans, or sometimes like skin biopsies or say spinal taps. And all of this is because we're trying to introduce more objectivity into these trials. So in some, there'll also be additional digital devices, like patients may wear an electronic watch that captures their movements when they're at home. So there are more procedures or devices, but all of it is there to capture biomarkers or to more closely track the patient than just a slice of time when they're in the office.
I thought of one other thing I would want to add if I could too. Dr. Agarwal's mention of the objective measures reminds me that one important concept that that patients and physicians should keep in mind when we're doing clinical trials is that we kind of put on a different hat when we're in a clinical trial. When we're in the clinic, when we're taking care of patients and when patients are coming to be to receive medical care, we have more of a optimistic and hopeful approach to things. And when we're in a clinical trial, it's really important to be as objective as possible. Both the physician tries to be objective in evaluating what we're seeing in the patient, and the patient themselves has to be objective in reporting what they're feeling, reporting side effects. So we don't want to, that's an important way of distinguishing between a true benefit of the medication and what is known as the placebo effect. So kind of putting on that different hat, that researcher hat for both patient and physician is really important.
Dr. Agarwal, we'll start with you. Tell us a positive story or maybe a positive outcome of investigational drugs that you've encountered recently in your line of work.
Actually, we've had several positive outcomes recently. So there have been clinical trials that we've participated in over the last 5 years, and several of these drugs are actually already in market. So we participated in, say, Kyowa Kirin's trials on Nourians, that's approved. We participated in the long-acting amantadine trial, and Gocovri is now on market. And then, there have been other trials that we've participated over time, say like the Rytary clinical trials, long-acting carbidopa, levodopa. And it's extremely exciting and rewarding when you know that your patients have had earlier access to these drugs, even 4 or 5 years before they were ever approved. And when the drug gets in market, we as investigators, because we've so closely monitored patients on these drugs before they got approved, we know what to look out for when we start prescribing the medications when they're newly launched.
Dr. Burdick?
Yeah, I think Dr. Agarwal, again, was right on. I would add Embrija is another one that we've been involved in that's recently been added to the market, which is the inhaled form of levodopa. Yeah, it's incredibly rewarding to feel like, as I say, I think for patients too who've gone through and told me they've felt really rewarded when they can see the time that they put into these products turn into something that's now available for everybody with Parkinson's to improve their symptoms.
Dr. Burdick, we'll start with you here. What are some common misconceptions about clinical trials?
Well, I mentioned the placebo effect. I think that's a misconception that if you are getting a placebo, you're not getting any benefit out of it, right? So I guess the misconception is we wouldn't want to go into a clinical trial expecting to get benefit, but rather to be a part of developing treatments so that everybody gets benefit, and we develop treatments that we know are beneficial rather than we just think they're beneficial. Dr. Agarwal, do you have other ideas about misconceptions?
Probably, again, thinking that one's being used as a guinea pig. Whereas a trial, I think, is mutually beneficial all around. So patients have, closer attention. The way healthcare is, everyone, providers want to spend more time with patients. Patients want more time and attention. But because of the current health system, everyone feels like, they maybe are not getting as much time as they would want. And in a trial, you have the dearth of time and attention, and procedures that are very geared to one's safety as well as efficacy is one point of the drug. But a lot of it is surrounding safety. And so I think one shouldn't think of it like the guinea pig approach, because by the time it's come to human trials, there's been so much safety data done before FDA would even allow a medication to be used on a patient.
So that kind of answers my next question, which was going to be, how much risk is there involved in being in a clinical trial?
Well, there's, as with any medication, right? Every time we prescribe a medication, there's some risk of side effect. I think the important thing to recognize, as Dr. Agarwal alluded to, as a drug is developed, it goes through many hoops, right? Many safety steps to get even to the point of human clinical trials. There are multiple phases to clinical trials, which is an important thing to understand too. We've probably learned a lot about that over the last year as we've watched the COVID vaccines go through the different phases. But just to be specific about that, so phase 1 is the first stage of development of a drug being used in humans after it's already gone through many animal studies to make sure as much as we can that it would be safe in humans. And phase 1 are very small trials, really dedicated specifically to assessing dosing and looking for any safety issues. And if it passes through phase 1, in phase 2, you start using it in larger numbers, again, primarily looking at safety. And so by the time it gets to a phase 3 clinical trial, it's really gone through quite a rigorous screening, looking at safety issues, looking at efficacy, so that by the time it's in phase 3, while there is always going to be some risk, most of the time phase 3, we have a pretty good idea of what the major risks are.
Dr. Agarwal?
So yes, like every medication is on market has possible side effects. Study medications also do have possible side effects, and they are typically spelled out in great detail in the informed consent. And we typically give patients enough time that they can go home, discuss, think with family before they actually make a commitment. At that time, we are also available to answer any questions they have about possible side effects. And one very important thing to realize is that there is constantly a board, a DSM board, that actually monitors ongoing safety of the trial. So if any site anywhere, and sometimes these are like 50 sites internationally in a trial, if there's any major side effect, other sites are also informed about it. And this separate independent board also monitors the safety of the trial. So safety is not taken lightly. That's the major focus on any clinical trial.
Dr. Agarwal, we'll start with you here. And you brought it up, I think Dr. Dr. Burdick may have brought it up, but what has been the challenge, additional challenge to trying to conduct clinical trials during the time of COVID?
So that's a great question. And, as you know, it's particularly challenging for us because the first patient was diagnosed at Evergreen. And so initially, when everything shut down, right, it was the clinical trial visits were also, delayed or postponed, and some from the sponsor end, and some patients didn't feel comfortable coming into a clinic. And then initially, when we were also told to minimize any kind of inpatient contact, but then after a couple of months, things did start opening up. And we kept seeing patients who needed procedures because procedures you can't do virtually. But now pretty much all the new protocols that are being developed have like a backup plan for if there's a shutdown, then how to maximize use of virtual platforms. So that if you can see the patient in person, you do the visits in person. If you're not able to due to a shutdown, you can do some of the procedures virtually.
Dr. Burdick?
Yeah, I think it's like any other industry, really. It's been definitely a challenge, but we've learned how to conduct our usual business with safe precautions to minimize the risk of COVID. As Dr. Agarwal said, we can conduct some things virtually if needed. Generally preferable to be in person for many of the evaluations. And of course, for those cases, we have masks on and pay great attention to disinfection, and we take all the steps that everybody's learned to take at this point. So at this point, I'd say it's pretty much business as usual. Certainly, there was a period of several months last year when it was very difficult to be able to see patients and to move these trials along.
Got a question from the audience. Can you please talk more about spinal tap related to research?
So for spinal taps, like I mentioned, because some of these meds, you need to make sure that they do penetrate the brain. The only way sometimes to get that little window into the brain is through the cerebrospinal fluid. So, for other drugs that you're not trying to penetrate the brain, you can just do blood draws, right? But in neurology and in Parkinson's, pretty much all of these meds, you're trying to make them cross into the blood-brain barrier. And so the spinal taps are typically being done to make sure enough of the drug is making its way to the brain. And then also sometimes, for biomarker analysis, etc., typically they limit the spinal taps to 2 or 3 during the course of the trial. And, most patients tolerate it well. And there are generally things that we do to screen that a patient will likely tolerate a spinal tap well, like if they've had, say, back surgeries, or if they have some hardware in their spine, etc., then those we would automatically expect to be maybe a harder spinal tap, and then they would probably be a better candidate for trials that don't need spinal taps.
Dr. Burdick?
And that's the only point I would emphasize, is that everything Dr. Agarwal said is correct, but most of our clinical trials in Parkinson's do not require a spinal tap, just to be clear on that. It's used in some for the reasons that Dr. Agarwal listed, but if there is a concern about spinal tap, you can still participate in many of our clinical trials.
Other question from the audience. What are the most exciting things you see coming down the current research pipeline? Dr. Burdick, you want to start?
Sure. Well, this may be an opportunity to highlight one of our specific trials called the PRISM trial. And this is a study of a medication that's actually been used for diabetes for a number of years. It was approved for diabetes in 2012. So in addition to being used for diabetes, though, it's been discovered that it works on the brain, on the receptor called the GLP-1 receptor. And in the brain, it's thought to help reduce an inflammatory reaction that we sometimes, or that we can see as part of the pathology in Parkinson's disease. So, so in this PRISM trial, we're looking at the use of this medication specifically to help slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease. This is exciting because it's because it's a medication that's already on the market. Essentially, they've modified it a little bit so that instead of needing to be taken every day, it's given every week. But the point being that it's already a medication that's been established to be safe in the use of diabetes. So we have a little bit better safety understanding of it. And it's also exciting because there's a good reason to think that it might actually help slow down the progression of Parkinson's. This trial in particular is in a relatively early stage. It's a phase 2 trial in treatment of Parkinson's disease. But there has been some really promising data in animal studies. So they tested it on mice who had a mouse version of Parkinson's disease and saw that it not only improved the symptoms, the movement of the mouse with Parkinson's, but also helped reduce the progression of the disease. So it reduced the density of the Lewy bodies in the brain, for instance. So, so again, very promising treatment that I think is a real opportunity for slowing disease progression.
Dr. Agarwal?
So, on that same theme of trying to develop meds to slow disease progression, there's another trial that we are doing, which is called the PROSEEK trial, in which we are looking at an oral med that one takes up to once or twice a day compared to placebo. And that has the potential to possibly slow progression. Again, early phase is a phase 2 trial, so focus more on safety. Maybe too early to comment on efficacy, but another very exciting trial we actually have is something that's using actually an ear stimulator. So, we have some little muscles in our pinna of the ear that the nerves from there are, they end up in the brainstem or in the brain. And if you stimulate some of those muscles, you may actually sort of like deep brain stimulation, right? You are trying to overcome an intrinsic abnormal rhythm. Just stimulating the ear at the pinna at a certain frequency might take patients out from an off to an on time. So that's a trial that we've just started at the Booth Gardner. Other trials that we are looking at is maybe just look at people's typing speed on their home computers and see the dexterity on the keyboard. And that might help us monitor people's progress at home and not just in the office. There's also a study involving like skin biopsies, which might help us, identify just alpha-synuclein, diseases. And then, and then we have other trials that are looking at, say, sleep problems in Parkinson's. Then Dr. Burdick has a trial in which there's like patients who have constipation in PD, and these can happen early in PD or in later stages. So really a wide variety of motor and non-motor options in development.
Since everyone has, this is Barbara in our audience, since everyone has their own rate of progression, how do you tell if the intervention is actually making a difference, Dr. Burdick?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on the specific trial. So for instance, in the one I was referencing earlier with the diabetes medication, we do assess the rates of progression in terms of clinical signs and symptoms, but they also are looking at progression via DAT scan. So they're looking at a DAT scan at the beginning of the trial and a DAT scan at the end of the trial to see if they can observe any difference in the two, difference between the two groups, right? Whether you're getting the active drug versus the placebo. And a DAT scan, I probably should explain for the audience, is a scan that specifically assesses the density of the dopamine producing neurons, dopamine producing brain cells, that can help us in clinic diagnose Parkinson's disease, but in certain research protocols, it can help us assess the rate of progression as well. So that's that specific trial. There are other ways of doing it as well, but by and large, it's based on the rates of progression of the clinical signs and symptoms. And that's assessed using a variety of questionnaires asking about symptoms in very standardized ways, and with rating scales that we use in assessing the degree of the physical signs on exam.
And just to add to that, also, some, like Dr. Burdick had mentioned earlier, the importance of the placebo arm, right? So, for instance, in the PROCEED trial, when they are looking at comparing when patients who are in placebo need to start dopaminergic treatment because of breakthrough symptoms compared to patients who are on the study medication. So the hope is that the patients who are on the study medication that slows progression, ideally they would need to start symptomatic treatment such as carbidopa, levodopa later than the ones who are on placebo.
But really, the real answer to that is that that's the importance of the placebo group, right? Because if we just look at one patient and how they tracked from beginning to end, we would have no idea of what they would have been otherwise. So all of our clinical trials are based on differences in the populations, on differences in the averages between the groups that received the active study drug and the groups that received the placebo.
Final question from me, Dr. Burdick. What's your favorite thing about participating in research as a clinical investigator?
Well, I think it's actually the two things that we highlighted at the beginning. I really do enjoy actually having a little more time to spend with patients, and we do in the research visits get to know each other a little bit more than we can in the course of a typical fast-paced clinic visit. So that's been really rewarding. And then again, overall, I think the biggest reward is that sense that I'm playing my part in contributing to developing better treatments for Parkinson's. It can be a really challenging disease, even observing it from the outside as I do. And to feel like we're making progress in that is very rewarding.
Well, we thank you for being a part of our first passport experience. Dr. Agarwal had to leave. Dr. Burdick, want to thank you very much for all your information today. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Enjoyed it much.
A reminder to everyone as well that we're continuing Passport to Research series every Wednesday this month. So we will join you again next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. And thank you very much for joining us.